Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
The noble in his castle, the cleric in his church, the peasant in his hut, a simple social model that would last for centuries. But the more successful it was in re-establishing order, the more it encouraged the very forces that would sap its strength. The feudal order, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time, we got a hint of what feudal society was like in the early Middle Ages, with vassals pledging allegiance to their lords and fighting for them in return for a piece of the lord's land and the peasants that went along with it. So, on the one hand, we had an aristocracy of lords and vassals who had property, and on the other, the peasants, or serfs, as they might be called, who provided all of the work and, in return, got temporary permission to stay alive. But there was also a third class, the clergy, which was an integral part of the feudal power structure. The church had been doing well all this time. It had been given lands, it had been given treasure, and it could manage its wealth with greater continuity than secular landowners who varied in quality and who were often away robbing some other lord. The church never died. So the church got even richer, and it led a new cultural revival around the year 1000. This is the era described by a monk in Burgundy named Raoul Glaber, who didn't think much of his times in general. But he tells us that the fabrics of churches were rebuilt and every nation of Christendom rivaled with each other which should worship in the handsomest buildings. These churches Glaber talks about are in what we call the Roman style or Romanesque. Gothic was only invented a century later. But they are splendid enough, and while public buildings surged forward, so did public thought, or rather clerical thought about public matters. And this produced a new social model, much more realistic than the preceding one, which you recall had the king as a man of peace at the center of society, protecting everybody else. Although the clergy still saw the Christian ruler as important, now he was part of a wider Christian society, which was divided into three social categories, each with one particular function: the men who pray, the men who fight, the men who labor. In this model, the spiritual is superior to the temporal, and the sword is superior to the spade. One prays to save the soul, the other fights to save the bodies and the property of the community, and both deserve to be kept by the labor of others. So below them are the peasants working to feed them. It was a simple model, and its very simplicity kept it going for a long time. The model also provided a justification for idleness by making it appear honorable and representing manual labor as dishonorable, which of course it was when the model was forged. Those who could prayed or fought. Those who couldn't labored. And so production was a vulgar activity, and the noble and holy were idle and unproductive. It has been argued that there was a contrary Christian tradition. After all, Christ was a carpenter, and that monastic rules, like the rule of Saint Benedict, required manual labor. As the Latin saying goes, laborare est orare, to work is to pray. But the fact is that the only reasons why monastic rules recommended work were first to avoid boredom, during which the mind could wander in dangerous directions, and second, to teach humility precisely because labor was a humbling experience. At best, work was an encouragement to spiritual endeavor. Its task was to subsidize prayer and contemplation so they could proceed without material difficulties. Productivity was no concern of noble minds. And this is a notion that was going to leave its mark on Western society and culture. Furthermore, the tripartite model of clergy, nobles, and commoners, which was intended to represent order, in fact created friction, the bitterness and hostility born out of the power relations it depicted. Realizing the friction, the Church tried to reduce it by propagating the notion that the social order was based on cooperation and services mutually rendered. This painting, entitled Allegory of Good Government, by the 14th century artist Lorenzetti, reflects the idea of cooperation and interdependence. The symbols of justice, peace, fortitude, prudence, common good, magnanimity, temperance, and charity all rest upon a unified people below. And here we have the allegory of bad government, in which Lucifer stands center stage and everyone else is bickering and selfish. In truth, some people were cooperating and serving more than others. As Western Europe ran out of barbarians and began to settle down, however relatively, marsh, forest, fallow gave way to vineyards and orchards and fields. New villages sprang up to clear and work new lands. The volume of production continued to rise. And since this took place in a system which was very good at squeezing what it could from the laborers at the bottom of the heap, most of the new surplus was transferred into the masters' barns and onto their tables. This surplus stimulated the master's taste for luxury. So, to satisfy this new demand, teams of specialists developed out from the indistinct peasant mass. Masons, artisans, traders, and this revival of demand for services brought about in turn a revival of the towns where the exchange of services took place. Urban centers had been insignificant for several centuries, but in the 11th and the 12th centuries, the ancient cities revived, and new market towns sprang up at crossroads, at river crossings, at convenient stops along the highway. By the end of the 12th century, Western civilization had once more gone through a fundamental change. It had been rural for nearly 1,000 years. From now on, it was going to be dominated by urban centers. Everything was going to revolve around the towns: riches, power, and cultural creativity. Now, naturally, such a profound transformation had an impact on the model of the three orders and on the social relations this model tried to stabilize. Within each order, material progress complicated the social hierarchy. In the church, the urban revival emphasized the break between the rural monastic orders and the monasteries, and on the other hand, the urban clergy that grew up around the new town cathedrals. Among the aristocracy, the growing importance of the urban economy strengthened those lords who controlled the markets at the expense of those who lived in the country. But the greatest revolution took place not at the top, but in the third estate among the commoners. The lowest of the three orders had become increasingly multiple, increasingly diverse. Peasants continued to represent the immense majority, but even at the rural level, there was more mobility, and some peasants had become better off than others. But the contrast was strongest in the towns, with their artisans, journeymen, and small traders, and especially with the merchants, who operated on a larger scale and who, in some cases, had become merchant princes. Professional organizations were also developing, guilds and fraternities which defended the interests of a parish or a trade, and corporations of masters and students in the new schools that had been established. These schools started out first in Bologna and Paris, but they soon appeared in every large city, working under charters granted by the Pope or the Emperor or the King. The word university is simply medieval usage for such independent corporations. But with all this change came more conflict. Typical of the struggle between the old order and the new forces was the agreement signed in 1215 between John, King of England, and his barons, an agreement that has come down to us as Magna Carta or the Great Charter. By the time John became king, royal administration had improved, but royal finances had not. So John taxed the nobles, the clergy, and the cities. He encroached on their privileges, and by sending out his officers to tax, he brought the kingdom to the verge of civil war. The only way to avoid a conflict was by an agreement which spelled out the rights of free men, especially barons, of course, and of clergy, but also of towns and merchants. This recognition of new interests was significant, even though nobody took the charter very seriously at the time, because feudal agreements were always breaking down. But out of its provisions, there grew basic legal rights for Englishmen, and also a representative institution called Parliament, designed to see that the king kept his word and did not overrun his rights. So this reactionary feudal document, which was meant to protect the interests of the great, became the basis of ever more progressive institutions. By this time in Europe, economic activity at all levels had loosened old restraints and weakened feudal bonds and clan loyalties. With prosperity, Europe became more adventurous, interested in material progress, believing that the world was created for man and man was spiritually responsible for mastering it. The Times suggested a new hope for personal success and spread the extraordinary idea of progress, the notion that things were actually getting better, that your only hope was no longer in heaven alone, but on earth as well. You could expect to better yourself if you worked hard, if you fought well, if you showed enterprise in business or skill in managing your lord's affairs. A good indication of this new spirit was that Europe now turned from a defensive posture to an offensive one. It embarked on the sort of imperialist adventure that is characteristic of societies that are bursting with energy, vitality, and self-confidence. Between the 11th and the 13th century, 8 major expeditions went out to rescue Jerusalem and the holy places from the infidel Turk. The First Crusade, as these armed pilgrimages were called, captured Jerusalem in 1099. And the resulting Christian kingdom of Jerusalem lasted nearly 100 years. By the 13th century, however, the original enthusiasm had run out. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, which was supposed to be directed against Egypt, wound up capturing Constantinople instead and set up a Latin kingdom there that lasted 60 years. But people were losing interest. By the end of the 13th century, all Crusader strongholds in Syria and Palestine had fallen, with Acre, the last, in 1291. Recapturing the Holy Land from the infidels was certainly a crucial factor inspiring the Crusades, but there were other interests at work. The most important was the determination to reduce the fighting and disorder in Europe by exporting them abroad. Or if that wasn't possible, feudal high spirits could be turned to useful ends by directing them against Christian heretics at home. All heresies threatened the ideological monopoly of the church and therefore had to be put down. And so the first Christian heretics were burnt at the stake soon after 1000 AD. In the 13th century, a crusade was launched against the Albigensians, or Catars, the pure ones, who lived in the Albi area of southwest France. The Albigensians were a particularly serious threat because they considered God and Satan, good and evil, to be co-equal in power. Everything material, the world and matter, was created by evil. This included political structures, the feudal system, and also the church, because it pretended that salvation was possible in this world. So the Albigensians threatened everybody in power. They couldn't be tolerated, and they were put down without mercy. The Crusaders of the Middle Ages did not discriminate. They killed Europeans as enthusiastically as they killed non-Europeans. As a matter of fact, after the siege of one Albigensian stronghold at Béziers, when a soldier asked the bishop how to tell the good Catholics apart from heretics, the bishop was blunt. Kill them all. God will recognize his own. But the most popular kind of crusade was the one fought to convert the foreign heathen, preferably not too far away, and if they didn't convert, to kill them and settle good Christians on their lands. The reconquest of Spain from the Arabs was a profitable campaign that went on into the 1490s. and the expeditions that Spain and Portugal sent to North Africa and across the Atlantic to America were also crusades of sorts. So the crusading tradition and the colonial experience merged into one another, as did their inspirations. High spiritual aims and low material ones, the desire to get away from home and the desire to get rid of troublesome enemies, vigor and enterprise and greed. But at the same time, people were trying to affirm themselves unconstrained by their elders and betters, and especially unconstrained by the church. In the 12th century, a profane secular culture appeared, emancipated from the church, sometimes critical of it, and reflecting a new public of city people who wanted to enjoy their new prosperity, and of lords and ladies who wanted to enjoy each other. In Cologne, which was then the most important city in Germany, the city poet wrote a song whose first verse goes like this. Down the primrose path I post, straight to Satan's grotto, shunning virtue, doing most things that I ought not to. Little hope of heaven I boast, charmed by pleasure's auto, since the soul is bound to roast, save the skin's my motto. There must have been a lot of people who felt this way and who didn't mind saying what they thought, which tells you something about the changed spirit of the time. There were also new games of love, which may not have been serious, but which do suggest emancipation from the religious beliefs of more constricting times, and also gentler habits, a rediscovery of manners and gallantry, everything we describe as chivalry. A good example of this is a well-known romance of the time. Around the year 1200, somewhere in France, a troubadour, a traveling poet and singer, created the love story of Aucassin and Nicolette. Aucassin, the son of a count, loves and wants to marry Nicolette, who is a captive maid of no apparent station, just bought back from the Saracens. Aucassin is told that he must marry a girl of his station, the daughter of a king or of a count, and if he makes Nicolette his mistress, then he will never enter paradise but go to hell. And this is what he answers. What have I got to do in paradise? I seek not to enter there, provided that I have Nicolette, my most sweet friend, whom I love so much. For none go to paradise except such people as I will tell you. Old priests go there, and old cripples, and those maimed wretches that grovel all day and all night before the altars, and those folk clad in old threadbare cloaks and in old rags and tatters, who are naked and barefoot and full of sores and die of hunger and thirst and cold and miseries, these go to paradise. With them I have nothing to do. But to hell I will go, for to hell go the fine clerks and the fine knights who have died in tourneys and grand wars, and the brave soldiers and the noble men. With those will I go. And there too go the fair and gracious ladies, who have friends 2 or 3 beside their husbands, and there go the gold and the silver and all the fine furs, and there too go the minstrels and the poets and the kings of this world. With those will I go, so that I have Nicolette, my most sweet friend, with me. You can see here a reversal of all accepted values. As long as his father refuses to give him permission to marry, Aucassin refuses to fight in the war that threatens his father's estates and his own. And finally, father and son make a deal, And Aucassin fights and wins, only to find that his father breaks his word. No, he will not let him see Nicolette after all. And so Aucassin releases the enemy leader whom he has taken prisoner, and he charges his enemy to do his father as much harm as possible. And so you see every accepted value, Christian, filial, feudal, trampled by this love-crazed loon. As for the young lovers' adventures, they go on and on. They lose each other, they find each other, they kiss, they marry, and they live happily ever after, which is as good a place as any to end. Next time, a look at everyday life in the Middle Ages. Please join us then.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information about the Western Tradition television course, transcripts, pre-recorded videocassettes, off-air taping, or related books based on the television series, viewers should call the Annenberg CPB Projects 1-800-LEARNER telephone number, or write to the Annenberg CPB Project, 1111 16th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.
This is PBS.